I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the amazing poem in Micah chapter 4 in preparation for our sections next time. And I'd like to look at Micah chapter 4 verses 1 to 5 and keep another finger in the parallel version of this poem in Isaiah chapter 2. There's many little differences between the two, but I'm more interested for the purpose of discussion in sections what some of the major differences between the two uses of the poem are. And I'm not so concerned as to whether Isaiah had it first or Micah had it first. They're rough contemporaries and they're both in the southern kingdom. My working hypothesis would be that this is a poem of Zion associated with the temple. That seems pretty clear from verse 1 of Micah chapter 4, but that Micah takes it in a particular way, being a Sinai prophet who's also trying to speak with some convincingness in Jerusalem to the Jerusalem land grabbers, to the Jerusalem nobles and royalty. He's going to give what he can in the way of Zion theology, but also step back a little bit and make sure that his Sinai focuses on economic justice and chesed love between co-vassals are there in power and in strength. There's a similar move in Micah's prophecy about the coming Davidic ruler. He's able to affirm that the Davidic line will produce a messianic ruler eventually, but he moves that ruler out into the countryside, out into the villages, out into Bethlehem, assuming that the royal system, the oppressive system of extraction of surplus in the capital in Jerusalem will be judged and removed by God. So let's go ahead and look at Micah chapter 4. The first verse is clearly talking about Zion theology, and it's looking in an eschatological direction when some of the archetypal and cosmic dimensions of the temple will finally manifest themselves in power in an incontestable way. We'll look at a little video right now, the so-called garden relief from Assyria with some amazing Edenic qualities. The temple on a hill, an Eden-like setting, the famous hanging gardens of the ancient Near East seemingly depicted very clearly here. Let's take a look real quick. I hope you enjoy this little snippet. In the relief, breathtaking waterworks keep the garden around the temple beautifully fertile. The hilltop location of the temple should be identified with the cosmic mountain. An altar stands in the middle of the sacred way up the mountain to the temple. And then turning to verse 2, we've got a two-way movement here. God's instruction is going down from Mount Zion, and the peoples are drawn in, the peoples of the world. So there's a universal outreach here. This verse can work with both Zion and Sinai theology, because Sinai theology has a huge emphasis on teaching, on instruction. And right in the midst of verse 2, we have the word teach, Yarah in Hebrew, from which we get Torah, the stipulations of the Sinai covenant. So, and they're flowing almost as water here, flowing down into the world. Got two pictures to show you here, two pieces of artwork. We'll pause for a second to look at both of those. They are both by the amazing old Jewish artist Moshe Berger from his book Visions of the Psalms Through the Gate of Colors. We've seen some of his amazing artwork before. In this one, the letters of the Torah and the colors of love and mercy, his special symbolic colors, are seen to spread out from the source of life, from Eden, from the top of the cosmic mountain. In times of joy or in times of distress, Berger explains, the presence of the Almighty is always there for God's people to call upon. Turning to verse 3, we have perhaps one of the more famous verses in the Bible, one I think that would be very easy to preach on. And I have a couple of artworks to show you. In particular, I'd like for you all to consider an amazing African work of art. This is called the Tree of Life, but it's an amazing illustration from Mozambique of the beating of weapons of war into implements of agriculture and shalom and peace. It was suggested by a bishop, Bishop Sengulain, in 1992, that all of the weapons that Cold War powers had been waging a surrogate battle in Mozambique, all these weapons that had been retained in the bush and represented a great danger for conflict to break out again and more violence to erupt, that these weapons be gathered in what was called the Plowshares Project, and a process of transforming arms into tools would take place. Mozambicans were encouraged to hand over weapons in exchange for plows, bicycles, and sewing machines. The weapons were then cut up and turned into imaginative sculptures by groups of artists working in Maputo, the capital of Mozambique. So we have an example of this in the Tree of Life. I hope we can discuss that in sections if we have time. Verse 4 is very, very interesting, and I think this is clearly an insertion over against the Isaiah text. And so I wonder if we can reflect upon what verse 4 is doing. We've got this grand universal vision of peace that even the United Nations can embrace. So peace and the removal of war at a global scale, a United Nations scale. But verse 4 is bringing it, I think, in at a different level and suggesting that the global solution is not possible without the sorts of concerns of Sinai that are unique to Micah and that are interjected in verse 4. So think about that. I don't want to say too much more, but I do have some historic and Near Eastern pictures of vineyards and gardens, vines and fig trees that I'll display for you to look at and enjoy in preparation for sections tomorrow. Now finally, in Micah chapter 4, verse 5, we've got the concluding refrain. There's something similar in Isaiah. They both go in a slightly different direction, but I think the function in each case is the same. And I want to raise that for you to think about. What is verse 4 doing? Verse 5 doing of Micah chapter 4? Certainly it seems to describe a different frame than we've opened with. We've opened with the eschatological, the coming of God's reign, the movement away from the mundane and the quotidian towards the ideal. But this ideal is not just wish fulfillment. It should function as a critique of the moment, of the present, of the here and now, where the rubber hits the road. And I wonder if verse 5 is not also addressed more directly and explicitly to the meanwhile time. And in fact, let me read you Eugene Peterson's translation in the Message of verse 5, because his paraphrase begins verse 5 with the word meanwhile. Now, I think one of the challenges with verse 5 is that more than one interpretation is possible, and many people kind of give what the nations are saying here kind of a blessing or a baptism. Diversity is okay, which to a certain extent, yeah, we want freedom of religion, but that is not, I don't think about this and we'll discuss it in section, But at least Peterson's translation does not understand verse 5 in that way, giving a baptism to the status quo in the meanwhile period. I don't think that would fit in well with the critique that the vision of the elevation of the cosmic mount and the flowing down like water of the Torah is pointing towards. I don't think verse 5 contradicts verse 1, in other words. So Eugene Peterson, meanwhile, all the other people live however they wish, picking and choosing their gods. But we live honoring God, and we're loyal to our God forever and always. All right. Hopefully this is suggestive, giving you a few things to chew on. There should be plenty to talk about in sections. It's a very powerful passage. It occurs twice in the Bible, in Micah 4 and Isaiah 2. So I think there's a double mandate for us to take this poem very seriously. Looking forward to talking about this poem with you in sections.